Welcome to My on Mondays, an explorative approach to the possessive my through narratives, art, and sound. Each Monday brings a new creation and unique perspective. My on Mondays is brought to you by MING Studios, a contemporary art space and international artist residency program dedicated to the exhibition, experience, and exploration of arts and culture. Along with exhibiting artists from around the world, MING also serves the community by hosting innovative programs including performances, workshops, screenings, readings, artist talks, and other cultural activities. For more information, or if you'd like to participate in My on Mondays, you can visit our website at mingstudios.org. Good morning and welcome to the 47th episode of My on Mondays. Today is a continuation of our Disappearing Worlds series, where we talk about things that are either gone or in danger of being lost due to factors like gentrification, climate change, or simply time. My guest for this episode is Gaelic language consultant Àdhamh Ó Broin. While he's best known for his work on the Starz Network series Outlander, Àdhamh has worked tirelessly as an Indigenous language and culture activist through various projects such as Dorlach, an organization working to salvage Scotland's perishing Gaelic dialects. In our discussion, we talk about the modern-day effects of colonization and marginalization in Scotland, and Àdhamh tells about his own process of decolonization, which included learning to speak Gaelic himself, then reviving the local dialect of his region and teaching it to his children. Hello. So fantastic to talk to you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, welcome.
Yeah. So as I said in the email when I spoke with you earlier, I've been following your work for a number of years. And so it's a real treat for me to get to talk to you in almost person. So am I correct? You live in Glasgow right now?
Yeah,
and you're originally from the Argyll region of Scotland?
Yeah, I grew up between Argyll and Glasgow. My parents parted ways when I was about 6 going on 7, I think. And then I was back and forward between the two places.
Okay.
More or less my whole life until my father passed away just over 10 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I see. One of the things that we spoke about initially in our email conversation, which I was really pleased to hear you speak about, was your own family tree. I know I read somewhere that you're on one side of your family, you're Irish, and then...
Yep.
Okay, so...
That's my father's side.
Okay, and so you were looking at your Scottish side of the family tree and trying to discern who had actually stayed in the area, and you were only able to find a single relation, which is incredible to me. And so, which you say is comes off the back of centuries of colonialism and marginalization, and
oh yeah.
And I mean, without going into the history of that, I think there's a lot of Americans, I hope, who actually know that history because it's so entwined with our own history.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm curious what you notice today. What are the modern day effects of this lack of representation of the Native people in this place? This is your own ancestral land.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the commodification of the land, commodification of culture, commodification of everything into saleable goods, into saleable items. So whether that's houses, whether it's land, whether it's forests, whether it's mountains, come and climb this mountain because it's so fantastic. I've got 5 stars on this app. And, that's obviously only just a recent symptom of the disease, that this sort of internet app-driven, social media-driven Instagram tourism thing. But the roots of that are long ago. When you think of the fact that the Victorians began to think of the Highlands suddenly as an attractive place to visit, and rather than the dark, foreboding hell that they considered it previously, full of people who refused to be tamed, refused to sort of kowtow to the quote-unquote civilization that England could bring.
Yeah.
I mean, how many Indigenous peoples across the world have had to suffer under that yoke? So they suddenly kind of turned round once the Highlanders, and I suppose it was fully similar at a certain point in parts of Ireland. Once the most fearsome fighting force in Western Europe, the Gaels, had been tamed, then the land was no longer somewhere that Gaels could be hiding around every corner, waiting to mug people passing in horses and carriages or whatever. The place was now an attractive holiday destination. And so what you find is, the landscape starts to be painted by romantic painters who start to portray it as this attractive place to go. People like Wordsworth are coming up to Scotland and writing, waxing lyrical about it. Queen Victoria suddenly decides it's her favourite place in the world. Walter Scott starts writing about the Highlanders as being romantic suddenly, when before they had been sort of idiot brutes, And of course, the ironic thing is that the Highlanders had thought of the Lowlanders as the idiot brutes. The Highlanders thought of the Lowlanders as the pale-faced, kale-eating, whiskey-drinking, because the Highlanders didn't have this whiskey tradition we have now. The chiefs drank imported wine, the clans people drank ale, and this crude sort of spirit that was getting distilled was actually a lowland thing. So many things have been flipped in their heads. The Highlanders rarely wear kilts now, whereas Lowlanders will wear them at their weddings, and things like that. It's a really peculiar situation. We've got a natural schizophrenia in Scotland, and I use that term strictly in a non-medical sense with respect to those who suffer from that disorder. But we do have this natural schizophrenia. But suddenly we find the Highlands, having been pacified, then becoming a destination for holidaymakers and for people who want to treat our deer, who to us are a totemic animal. They're sacred to us. Our deer and our salmon, no two more totemic animals in Gaelic culture. They want to treat these as commodities, and suddenly the Gael can't, go up on the moor and shoot a stag. We can't go to the stream and take a salmon. We can't just go and get a log from the forest in order to make the things we need out of wood. So this is a sort of process that's set in motion. And then ultimately, when you come down to the modern age and you get the revivalist take on Gaelic language, which is really a process of commodification as well. And now people are looking at the economic benefits of Gaelic, rather than the fact that what it actually is for people who are ethnically Gaelic, and who recognise that legacy. What it actually is for us is a zip line, back into the primordial crucible of our people. It's an interface with the natural world and the land on which we stand. It's not something that can be packaged up and sold for economic benefit. But this is the sort of situation that we're in just now. So the people, my people are sort of started to break up in terms of not being able to make a living from the land anymore. During the famines of the 19th century, the genocide in Ireland, and the so-called famine, but it really was a genocide in Ireland, and then the famines that affected the Highlands as well. It's really the middle of the 19th century, and you start to see my people beginning to come across from Ireland or down from the Highlands, and that process basically sort of rages on through until the mid-20th century. And so over that century, really, from the famines of the mid-19th century through to the conclusion of the Second World War, you see this total drain of my people and really everyone's people. Everyone knows a similar story. You see populations in these townships, being halved and then quartered, and it's they're only being bolstered now by people who have enough money to buy the commodified land and houses. So this process results in a total lack of agency for native people. And I mean, goodness gracious, here you've got a Scottish Gael of Irish and Highland descent saying this, but if we had one of my Mohawk friends or my Wet'suwet'en friends or my Maori friends here, I mean, they would just be saying exactly the same thing,
Yeah.
So the lack of agency because of lack of free interface with the land, because the land has been commodified into a saleable item, then leaves people sort of rootless and dislocated and unable to essentially steer their own ship. So we end up with this kind of anchorless ship, and people just get they just career out to sea in this anchorless ship. And eventually a lot of them go under. I mean, when you think of the amount of drug and alcohol issues and all sorts of domestic violence, goodness knows what, that goes on amongst displaced peoples, it's because they're rudderless, anchorless ships. Mm-hmm. So this is the sort of thing that happens, and then here you have me, a rudderless ship, as a teenager going into my early 20s, surviving through rock and roll. I mean, it definitely saves souls, no doubt about it. Takes them as well, of course. But there you have me surviving through playing music, a definite rudderless boat. And just this one grandmother, the only grandparent I had, who was off of these Highland people but had lost the language and all that, passing me a couple of phrases she still had, telling me where my people came from, who they were, handing on the old handwritten family trees and quill and ink and all this sort of a thing. But of course, as a teenager, you're going, oh, that's brilliant, that's fascinating, I love it, and I really did. But you're not really getting the gravity of what this actually means. You're thinking about it, oh yeah, that's my family tree. But what it actually is just one representative legacy from one conglomeration of people who happened to get together and get married and have kids and all the rest of it that finally resulted in me. It's only, you don't realise that it's only one facet of this dirty diamond of the colonial model, which has resulted in all this dislocation. And so when I then came to realise I was, going to marry my wife here and we were going to have a family, I already had one daughter previous to that, but when I realised we were actually going to intentionally have a family, then I kind of said, well, what do I want for them? Do I want the dislocation to continue so that they fill up the holes in themselves with the commodities that actually previously belonged to their people? Which is the huge irony about it, or do I want them to grow up from as early as I can possibly manage with their own language, with their own culture, as much a part of them as their own hands or the air they breathe, or how do I want to do this? And so that's what I did. I just said the buck stops with me, and that's it. I'm not allowing them to live this dislocation, because I came out of my early 20s in a desperately mentally degraded state, really bad struggles with alcohol, drugs, and goodness knows what, and mentally just a total and utter mess, and it was like, well, where did all that come from? Why did all that happen? And do I want to pass this crap on, or do I want to act as the filter that every good parent should be, and essentially let all the dead rats and goldfish and toilet paper hit the net before it flows out into the sea? So that was a long answer.
No, but it's fantastic, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. I come from a mixed racial heritage. I actually just met my father, who is American, about 6 years ago, and so I've been sorting out his ancestry. At this point, I know more about our family than he does, and I didn't grow up in it. But on my mother's side, my mother's from Venezuela, and so on my maternal side, I'm a first generation American, and I've always felt this sort of very this dislocated, sort of floaty feeling, not really having any connection to this place where I was born and raised. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, what that dislocation from our ancestral lands does to a person. I mean, I've seen what it's done just to my own mother and her siblings, and it's immense. One of the things I think that comes up a lot in your, this is just another extension of what you have already been talking about, is decolonialization. And decolonization is something that's really central to your work. And I think there's so many people that haven't even heard the term before. And so I would like to know, what is your definition of it, and what does that process mean to you? How, aside from just learning the language, what are the ways, because there's traditions that have been lost. There's all kinds of things that have been lost.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because at the end of the day, it depends how far away your ancestral tradition is. Mm-hmm. For some people, they are, for instance, first generation British citizens, or first generation American citizens, or Canadian citizens, mm-hmm. and it happened that only just whatever the previous generation, their people were. I don't know, they were Basque, or they were Sami, or they were whatever, mm-hmm. And they still have access to that through their parents. And whether their parents are speakers of the language or not, of course, another thing, and that's another facet of it. But if the further back you go with a connection, say you're fourth or fifth generation, but you're still, in a sense, as you say, because of that dislocation, you're still the child of incomers, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. And you quickly realise, the more you delve into it, that so much of the kind of lack of sense of place is quite strictly just to do with the fact that you may never have set foot on ancestral soil. And I mean, I hadn't been to Ireland until I was 36 years old.
Oh, wow.
I hadn't been to Caithness until I was 27. So that just shows you, and since going to these places, I mean, it's almost like there's been an automatic reversal of certain insecurities and certain, a lack of groundedness and that. So my thing with the decolonization is a really simple thing, and people will be like, oh yeah, very good, like that's not very imaginative or particularly instructive, but this is actually the way to do it from experience. As you go back to where your people are from, and if you're of a very mixed heritage, this can often be challenging as well. This is the other thing. But you then have to, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to tell people what to do, but in my experience is if you have heritage from, say, 3, 4 or more different places, you have to put them on your bucket list to get there. So rather than going on holiday and putting your feet up for 10 days in the sun, whatever, by all means do that. But, I'm not telling you what to do. But if you're really keen on the decolonization thing, if you really want to delve into your heritage, then you have to put these things aside. And you have to sacrifice coming back in any way relaxed from these holidays, mm-hmm. because you're going to come home with more questions, more challenges, and if so do that and hit all these places that your people are from. Take off your socks and shoes and walk on the bare earth, and that's all I can say. If you spend a few days walking on the bare earth, and that your people walk that same earth, that is almost 50% of the journey just in one go done. Now, it affects different people differently. Some people might feel absolutely nothing. The chances are that, maybe whatever, I don't know, the DNA memory thing, maybe it's not come down as strongly from that place. Experiment some more, go to another place that your people come from. Try all these things out. And as I say, it maybe sounds very simplistic, but for me, it's absolutely step one. And then when you feel that connection, and sometimes the connection won't happen until you get home, back to where you happen to abide, and then you suddenly 5 nights later, once you're home, you're lying and you burst out crying. You're like, oh my God, I missed that place I was in, or whatever. There are all kinds of different things that can happen, and I'm just riffing on these. I'm just saying random things, just because at the end of the day, for everyone it will be completely different. But that's the first thing to do. So get your feet on the soil.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I first discovered you through your Dalyada website, where you have recordings and written things in the dialects, the native dialects of Gaelic, from various parts of is it just the Argyll region? It is, isn't it?
It's just central Argyll. Yeah, okay. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I discovered your work through that website, and I can't remember how I found it. But so I want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with the language. I guess you could be called an Indigenous language activist. And you started yourself by learning the Gaelic language. And then can you tell me a little bit about that process for you, how that began?
Yeah, just following on from my answer to the last question, of course, I didn't realise I had to get my feet planted onto the soil. So I actually started with the language. The language was how my decolonization process began.
Okay.
But actually, it's really 2 or 3 steps down the list.
Yeah,
But not realising that at the time, and also being in Glasgow, and at the time being a student and being pretty skint, pretty broke, it was like, well, I can't just hop a train up to Caithness. I don't have the money. I don't have a car. I can't just go over to Ireland. So, what I did was, well, I can learn the ancestral language even if I can't learn the exact dialect. So that's what I did to start with. I just got every single book that I could find, every single resource. I did every single thing apart from actually attend any kind of... Well, I did my Gaelic hire ultimately just for the sake of putting it on the list of hires that I got. That's like, what's the equivalent in the States? It's like when your SAT or something, is that right? Before you go to uni? Yeah, so the grades you get before you go to university. So I was like, I never got one of those in Gaelic, and I feel aggrieved about that. I should have been able to do that in school, and it's my people's language. So I went back and did that for the sheer sort of sake of putting that wrong right. But otherwise, I didn't really take any classes apart from go along the odd conversation class and things like that. Pretty much did it all myself, and just sitting devouring every single book I could get a hold of. But pretty quickly, I realised that this Gaelic that I was learning was, the standard, the equivalent of newsreader English or something. Do you know what I mean? It had no relation to me whatsoever. And at the time when I became semi-fluent in language, I was speaking, I suppose, a broadly South Uist leaning dialect originally. I'd only ever been to South Uist once on a bike with my mates. Slept in a tent, drank a load of beers and went home. Do you know what I mean? I knew nothing about Uist.
Yeah.
So it was silly that I was speaking a standard tongue. And so I'd always been looking into what the dialects were all about. And at one time there was over 200 in Scotland.
Yeah, I was just reading an article about that. And I guess I should, for the listeners, because there's a lot of people who aren't going to know anything about Gaelic at all. I was just reading an article that at one point, I think it was in the 1950s, there were still 200 dialects or variations or whatever you want to call them of Gaelic that were still being spoken in Scotland. And now there are only 2 that are considered...
viable,
that can continue to survive, and one is the Lewis dialect and the South Uist dialect. So that's what you're speaking of. You were speaking the South Uist.
Yeah, I was, and I mean the broader language thing is Gaelic is Gaelic, the language of the Gaels. So the Gaelic people are from Ireland through the Isle of Man and the Highlands of Scotland at one time, much further south than that. And then there are sort of national, boundaries put up that, there's Irish, Scottish and Manx, but really there's not. That's geopolitics, in the cultural, ethnic sense, especially between Ireland and Scotland. There's a strong sort of sisterhood, and at one time there was just a dialect continuum which stretched from the southwest of Ireland right up to the very northeast, almost the northeastern tip of Scotland. So that was the situation there, and that continuum lasted until really about World War II, and then some of the bridging dialects between Scotland and Ireland fell into very, very poor repair. And of course, the north of Ireland had been planted intentionally by the British state, which really broke up that continuum and made Northern Ireland to an extent an other, whereas it wasn't really, of course, whatever your outlook on it, originally speaking, of course, shouldn't have happened. And it really interrupted the flow of Gaelic culture from one end of that continuum to the other. But so after a while, I learned the standard tongue and getting fairly conversational in it. My father, by that time, had moved from Mid Argyll to North Argyll, and I knew some old people there, plus a young fella who'd spent a lot of time with those old people himself, and he'd learned the dialect up there, Appin, Lismore kind of an area, to fluency. And I learned the first dialect, Gaelic that I learned was from him. And once I started to bring my standard tongue over towards Argyll, my natural inclination was to look and see if there was any people left in the area that I grew up in.
Yeah.
And so I went around there and I essentially got hold of every single person willing to speak to me, which was more or less everybody. And out of some people, all I got were words. But there were people who couldn't speak the language anymore, but who had words, one or two of which weren't even in the dictionaries.
Wow.
So there was precious material to be gathered. So I spent about a decade between 2010 and 2020, and I found a couple of people who were sort of conversational still, and recorded them, especially one of them at very great length. So I've got about 60 hours of this one fella on record. I've no idea what I'm going to do with it all, but he didn't care. He was just like, just crack on, son, just do what you need to do,
What a treasure. That's amazing.
The main thing that I did was that I began to speak the dialect. Well, I'd spoken Gaelic to my kids since they were born. And one of my kids, my 15-year-old, can still just remember the odd word that I used to use from the previous regime when I was still speaking standard Gaelic.
Yeah.
She can remember odd words that I used to use, but the other two don't remember me speaking anything other than this dialect. So I've spoken it to them more or less since they were born, and they're all now completely fluent native speakers.
Yeah.
So that intergenerational rift has been healed, to a great extent with that.
Yeah, that just is amazing to me that you did that, and so the idea is that they'll continue and teach their children and hopefully teach other people as well. And they're absolutely vociferous about the fact that there's not a chance they're speaking a word of English to their kids. So it's incredible. It's so beautiful. I was thinking about, as we talk about decolonization, there's so much that I think is incorporated into language, and it goes so much deeper than just communication. I was thinking back to a time where I was, a friend of mine, a Lebanese friend of mine, was trying to teach me a little bit of the Lebanese dialect of Arabic. And as he was doing so, I was trying to wrap my mind around this phrase. I don't even remember what the phrase was at the time, but it occurred to me, if I were to try to phrase something in the same way in English, it wouldn't make sense to anyone. And it was the first time, because I speak Spanish, but there's enough similarity that, it makes sense. But Arabic, it was my first realization that it illustrated to me how different the mind works. Yes. It was sort of like, wow, that's how you think of something? That is completely foreign, alien to me, and it was so fascinating. And so, I think when you lose these dialects, when you lose Indigenous languages, you're not just losing one form of communication. You're losing a whole different way of thinking, of seeing the world, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, no, you're absolutely spot on, and it is amazing how learning another language, especially when it differs significantly enough from your own, what it actually does. It really is, it's like the Matrix pill or something. You take it and suddenly, boom, you're educated in an instant, just by the realization of a few idioms you've been taught, that show you the grammatical structure of the language. And also the interesting thing is what speakers of a different language consider similar, or consider, not requiring of a separate term. For instance, in Gaelic, we talk about a shealachach is a slug and a snail. Now, the fact that one has a shell on its back is neither here nor there. It's just the same thing. Whereas the way that we would call a centipede, yes, we mentioned 100 legs, but what we actually compare it to, we say fia nangiat chas, which is the deer of 100 legs.
Oh wow!
Because it's got
that's
antlers.
Right. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So there's not a chance any English speaker would ever compare a deer to a centipede. It just would never happen.
Yeah.
And yet that's the way we look at it, you know. So
that's
so there we go, you know. And I think as well that there would be maybe people who would criticise me for saying that the land is dumb, as in D-U-M-B. You know, it's unable to speak. They would say, "Oh no, it's not." No, I know. Of course, it can speak. However, the land cannot actively advocate for itself because us humans are here as the stewards of the land, and that is our job, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. So the issue with losing local language is that the land loses its interface with other places. So the land sends out human beings as envoys from every place to speak of its wonders and its beauties, right? And then when these envoys come from that place and speak the language of the colonial invader instead of that of the place itself, then, you know, on whose behalf are they really speaking? And it tends to be that they are speaking on behalf of their own egos, their own insecurities, you know, their own skewed concept of what's important about the place. They're not speaking from a tradition of generations upon generations upon generations who have been in a symbiotic relationship with the land.
Yeah.
And this is something that incomers just cannot get their heads around. You know, and this is the thing. Obviously, I speak as someone who is the child of immigrants to Glasgow, which is a huge city. It's 1.8 million inhabitants, you know. So really you're lost in a sea of people here as you are in any other city, a condition that I you know, deeply regret having to live with, you know, but I've not found my road out just yet. But if you lose the language of the land, then the land ceases to be able to adequately advocate for itself. And that's another consideration that should really be top of the list, you know, because language isn't people think of it almost in a curatorial sense, you know, how fascinating and how interesting it is. And don't get me wrong, I mean, you and I think about it exactly the same way as well, but they often lack the grounding factors in what makes local language important. They lack understanding of how the language is rooted in the earth, and the fact that the symbiotic relationship exists between land and language. So the land forms the language that people speak because it provides the conditions and through, you know, in which people have to live their lives. But then the land is by the same token then named by the people who describe it according to the language that was gifted to them by the land. Yeah. So the land really names herself, in a sense.
Yeah, that is such an important point, and I think one that people probably never even think about. And that brings me back to the point of the sort of the standard version of Gaelic is it's called mid-minch, right? That's sort of what's being taught in schools. Am I correct about that? Yeah. Yeah, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, both with your own website, the Dalriata website, and then is it Dorlach?
Dorlach.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what you guys are doing?
Yes, so Dorlach is like an umbrella for projects like Dalriata Gaelic. So I myself have 2 revival projects on the go. The Dalriata Gaelic project is more or less complete, other than I'm saying more or less complete, other than the fact that we need to produce a dictionary and we need to get the rest of the material uploaded to dalriata.scot. That process really stopped when all of my old friends passed away. I mean, I've lost, it'd be 6 or 7 over the last 2 years. People who were still, to an extent, able to understand the spoken language a little bit, still come out with the odd word, you know, people who were, as Nancy Dorian called them, rememberers. And so that kind of stymied the process. It took the wind out of my sails. Yeah. And so the Dalriata project ground to a halt, and I freely admitted that on our Facebook page and just said, look, having lost all these people, it's really knocked the wind out of my sails.
Mm-hmm.
But the other project that I've been working on is the dialect of my mother's people, and that's Gaelic Scairlairn. And that was the language that was spoken in the extreme far northeast of Scotland, an area people don't associate with Gaelic language and culture at all, Caithness. So in the western half of Caithness, the Gaelic language was spoken as a first language by most people still in the mid-19th century. And it died away there before the Gaelic of Mid Argyll. There were still fluent speakers of Mid Argyll Gaelic, a few of them into this century, whereas Caithness fluent speakers, you perhaps had one or two still around in the 50s, and that was about it.
Wow.
So I would say it was about 50 to 60 years ahead of Central Argyll in terms of dying away. So when I first came to the language, and I was trying to work out how Caithness Gaelic would have sounded, I mean, I would be emailing any bugger that would listen to me, you know what I mean? Just saying, what do you know about this? People that I thought might be in the know. And just nobody knew anything.
Wow.
And so it's been about 15 odd years of just scraping the tiniest little fragments of, dirt off the back of stones. That's really how it's been to try and put the thing back together. But I can now speak the language in my mother's area pretty fluently, as well as the dialect of Central Argyll.
Incredible.
So, and then the next project will be trying to revive the Gaelic as it was spoken in County Derry, where my father's people are from.
Okay.
But that's still to come, and there's people already doing that at least. So that's going to be good to just plug into what they're up to and try and help rather than having to start it from scratch. But I'm very interested in this concept of the disappearing worlds, though. Because that's a really crucial conception in terms of what's happening here. Because I remember Nancy Doreen saying that the Embo fisher folk didn't feel that their dialect was dying. They felt that their language was dying because they didn't see the fact, they spoke a very peculiar, specific dialect. I mean, it's peculiar because just about to everybody other than themselves, it was peculiar,
Yeah.
They spoke this very, very specific dialect from the fishing villages of East Sutherland. And when it was dying away, they weren't thinking about, but it's fine, there's people on the West Coast that still speak Gaelic, teach it their kids and all the rest of it. They weren't thinking about it that way. They were thinking that their language was dying.
Yeah.
So the disappearing world concept is interesting because there were local expressions and people thought of their dialect just as their language, and it was all they had until English was forced into their lives. Then the disappearing world thing is literally these tiny fragments, it's like little icicles that are just slowly shrinking to nothing under the blazing colonial sun, and I'm trying to sort of pick them up and put them in, freezer locked bags and keep them refrigerated. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's an intensely sort of grief-laden process. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me, you're not running at your top speed away from the burning house. You're that idiot that goes back and looking for the bloody photographs, And I'm like, you know what? Yeah,
I totally sympathize. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, he helped me for years with my work. He documented a lot of my work, and brilliant guy. He meant it in the nicest possible way, but I was like, no, you're absolutely bang on. I am that idiot who runs back into the burning house. And there is an incredible melancholy about it, which, I mean, I've cried as many tears as I've smiled smiles during this process, and the only smiles of any great note other than time spent with my elders is time spent with my kids, because the rest of the process is just absolutely and utterly grief-laden from dawn till dusk. And it's just entirely exhausting. And I've no real, I've no real explanation as to why I do it. I can wax lyrical for an hour about it, and I might just about get close to the heart of it somehow. But I could also, just sit in silence and cry, and that would explain it just as well. It's really, really hard to explain why I do it, but I would call it an ancestral imperative or a cultural imperative.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, I really feel you on that one.
Aye. And I wondered if do you mind me asking, on your Venezuelan side, do you know if there was any indigenous Venezuelan folks?
There was, and I unfortunately, I do know that my grandfather's mother was indigenous,
Wow,
but
beautiful.
the sad thing is, I don't even know what tribe. It's,
Right.
I mean, that is how, I look at my family. I've lived in Venezuela. I've spent a lot of time there, and my mom still has siblings over there, and I was close with my grandfather and listening to people talk, and then spending time over there. There's so much of a self-hatred embedded in the culture. My family,
Yes.
I'm very
Yes.
fair. I'm very fair-skinned because my father is, white, blonde hair. My mother's
Okay.
side of the family is mostly African and a little bit of indigenous and a very small bit of Spanish. And I did discover DNA, which is super bizarre. The most surprising thing I found out, my mother has a tiny bit of Irish blood.
Really?
Well, yeah, I found a relative through her who is living in Dublin, and I emailed her and I said, do you have any idea of any familial connection that you, and it was very distant. It's, super far back.
Sure.
But
Sure.
she said, no, I have no idea. And then the next day she emailed me back and she said, Google the Irish in Venezuela. It's really interesting. And it turns out that, I'm assuming that this is what the connection is. It's the most likely story, that in the 1800s, the Irish, after the Napoleonic Wars, troops unemployed Irish soldiers went to Venezuela to fight with Simón Bolívar against the Spanish.
Well. That sounds like us.
So, yeah, I don't know. I got off totally on a tangent there, but
No, but sorry, that was my question asked.
Yeah, I know so little, and and I've been working on genealogy and trying to figure out, and I just can't get back very far because there's, I know on my grandmother's side, my maternal grandmother, her father was the son of a slave, and
Wow.
and
The plot thickens.
his father was from a well-known Spanish family. I figured out which one he was because it's a well-known family of an important artist in Venezuela, and because he was half Spanish, he was given up for adoption to another Spanish family because he was important enough that he couldn't be raised by a slave, but not because he was also half black, he couldn't be raised by his actual father.
Right.
So,
for goodness sake.
I mean, it's just, and then here I have, my grandfather's mother. I know she was indigenous, but I don't even know from what region or tribe or anything.
What region?
I know nothing.
Well, I know that there is quite a fair bit of confusion for people from Venezuela who have indigenous heritage, because I have a friend, it's actually my very good friend's partner. She and this friend of mine are coming to Scotland this year, in fact, to engage in some community work and to spend time with myself and others. And she is also part Indigenous Venezuelan. Mm-hmm. So if I have any tips on that front, I'll definitely extract those as politely as possible and pass them on.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make, though, is just about the self-loathing. As my mother, she's got the typical kinky curly hair of most Venezuelans, and my grandfather would hate it because she would just leave it natural. And, and he would say things, oh, you look like a negra, and I said, well, she is, no. And then, a really common thing is to say, oh, you look like an Indian. There's such a self-loathing embedded in the culture, and it's depressing.
Yeah, I mean, that's all very familiar. Mm-hmm. Obviously, within the Gaelic peoples, that there's a huge sort of spectrum of appearance variation, and it's very interesting, in fact, that we do have the quite discernible types. There are folk that I can pick out. If I walk past someone in the street, I can say, "Oh, he's a Uist man," or I can say, "Oh, she looks like she comes from Lewis," or, and it ranges from extremely pale people with sea blue eyes and so translucent skin and red hair or blonde hair, right up to people who are so dark-skinned that you would think that they would be Mediterranean at the least, with really dark brown eyes and almost black hair, you know. So it's really interesting. However, partly because of that variation already being inherent within the people, then the assimilation thing was really quite easy, of course, into mainstream British society, because there was no very, very particular Gaelic skin colour, for instance. We're just almost as pale as other people, but with that variation that's natural within paler skinned folk. So we never experienced any of that. What would I say? That marginalisation due to our appearance, particularly. Once we obviously ceased to dress differently, we ceased to hold ourselves differently, we ceased to walk differently. We weren't pushing into the blowing wind anymore or crouching under the rain, and we weren't doing the things that we normally did. And we assimilated then, of course, naturally huge sections of Irish and Highland population came in amongst the Glasgow people, and suddenly you start going, gosh, they've got a really Glasgow face. But then I would turn around and go, oh, I wouldn't say that. I would say actually they're Irish. And then you ask them and it turns out their grandparents are. So these stories start to become embedded in the kind of body politic of urban areas, and yet nobody actually knows where any of it comes from or why. So it becomes at once a mercy, because obviously the Gaelic people lack that marginalisation that people suffer because of the colour of their skin. But it also means that we assimilate so far that people get almost, in a sense, and I say this respectfully because people might disagree with me here, but they almost get more lost because there's no physical, really obvious physical defining feature. And people say, well, what about the red hair? And you're like, well, actually, that was originally Norse. So we can't even claim that.
Well, there's one last thing I'd like to ask you about, and this is shifting gears just a little bit. But I work for an arts organization. I'm a musician and myself, and so I'm really curious about. I know that you play music as well. You're involved in the arts in several facets. I believe you're involved in the production of some film projects as well, right?
Oh gosh, yeah, lots. A lot of people will be familiar with my work on Outlander, or they'll certainly be familiar with Outlander, the series that airs on Stars. I stopped working with them a couple of years ago now, but the first 5 seasons contain my work. Unfortunately, they were less careful than I was with the Gaelic, and some of the takes that get cut in are less than perfect, shall we say. But that's the problem working with Hollywood. It's the culture. The culture is a bit of window dressing, but it can quite often end up taking a back seat for behind other priorities, such as life. But the other couple of projects I've been working on, I was working on one called Origins, which hasn't made much progress in the last little while. It was, I suppose, almost like Scotland's answer to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, very light-hearted, very sort of silly. But potentially, I think it's got legs, and lots of Gaelic very liberally dispersed through it,
Fantastic.
But the other 2 projects, which were, one of them no less fantastical, but a little more serious in tone, is called The Herring Girls. A very talented lady by the name of Rekha Garton. It's RekhaGarton, and you'll find her in Instagram especially. And she's got lots of clips from so she's the writer and director. Fantastic script she penned as well. And I just shot that with Rekha and the rest of her crew a couple of months back. And that's the story of, as she puts it herself, merfolk, magic and madness. Not necessarily in that order, but it's it's being cut as we speak. It's a 15 to 20 minute short. But it's rammed full of Gaelic language. The only English in it, I think, is when at one point, one of the characters gets called a witch by somebody in English. So it's Gaelic language from end to end. All the parts were actually offered to either native or fluent Gaelic speakers, but unfortunately, very few of them were able to engage. So we actually only got one. So it meant that I had to teach the language to the other 3 girls who were all. They were all English, so it was shades of Outlander all over again. But gosh, they really did a tremendous job, and it sounds pretty bloody good to me. And great. So that'll be viewable and we'd imagine by the end of the year. And then the other project I was working on is one called 1815, and we shot that almost a year ago now. And that's actually there's a little film festival out of New York which is currently showing the film, so it can be viewed at the moment. So if you put 1815 screening New York Film Festival in, you'll be able to find it. I think it's like $14, and you get to watch all the films that are currently on the festival bill. And that is all about the clearances, all about that dislocation we were talking about, about that whole kind of scenario. And it's a really interesting kind of a juxtaposition of these two characters, an old man who's sticking to his guns and sticking with the language and everything that he knows and holds dear, and this young fellow who's going off to war and then returns and sort of pretends he doesn't speak Gaelic anymore. And there's a whole tension between the characters, and one speaks nothing but Gaelic and one speaks nothing but English.
Okay.
And it's really, really interesting the way it works. So I won't spoil it for anybody who's going to watch it, but naturally I would be biased in saying that these films are good, but I'm not going to beat about the bush. These films are very, very good. The Herring Girls 1815 Origins is yet to actually enter full production, but these two short films are excellent and well worth a watch, and culturally very, very rich.
Great. I will be sure to put the links in on the website when we put the podcast out.
Yeah, sure.
So my last question, music. What are you working on right now? What are you doing?
So, I'm glad you re-asked that section of that double-barreled question, because I'm very keen to talk about my family band. So my kids have been exposed to music the same way they've been exposed to the language ever since they were born. I was singing to them and singing Gaelic to them when they were in the womb, and they're all good singers, can hold a tune. But my boy plays the drums. His twin sister plays the fiddle and the clarsachs, the big Gaelic harp.
Fantastic.
And then my 15-year-old can play the pipe chanter and is pretty good at it, but has since sort of laid that down temporarily and moved over to the guitar, because that's my main instrument. And she seems, she's been playing it a month, and she's already, hammering away at bar chords and stuff. I mean, I don't know how she's doing it. She's, it took me a lot longer than that. But and then my eldest daughter, who's actually at university at the moment, actually she's in Canada just now. She's at university doing Gaelic and Chinese up at Aberdeen, so she can't take part in the band, but she's a bass player. So I've got the whole setup. If you go onto Instagram, then you'll find at Glan, GLAN _band, at Glan Band. My kids still aren't on social media personally, because I think it's an extremely bad thing to do before you're old enough to know how silly it all is. But we now have an Instagram that I run myself, and it's got little snippets of what we're working on. So it's old Gaelic classics with a kind of folk rock twist. So it reflects my previous musical entanglements with the traditional Gaelic side of things, and I think lots of harmonies, lots of nice woody, thuddy, the band sounding kind of musical aesthetic, and
I'm looking forward to checking it out. Wow. So thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure to me too. I have the most curse-worthy habit of running off at the mouth and banging my gums for Scotland, but
well,
just a shame there's not an actual medal or something, or my wall would be racked with them,
Well, you've reached the right audience today, so no problems here.
Brilliant. Oh, well, I'm glad you enjoyed.
Well, enjoy the rest of your evening, and
thank you.
I hope to speak with you again. I'll certainly be in touch.
Aye.
Okay.
Smashing. Right, Rebecca, all the very best then. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Ciao.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next Monday. Tune in.